Saint Teresa saw something that made her doubt God entirely. For years she had spoken with the divine, felt celestial hands upon her soul, experienced visions that elevated her beyond mortal comprehension. Then came the vision that changed everything, a revelation so twisted, so psychologically devastating, it convinced this woman of profound faith that she might have been speaking to the devil all along. The edge of madness is not about miracles. It is about the terrifying moment when a mystic can no longer tell heaven from hell. What did she see that night that made her question her entire existence? The convent walls were cold in the Spanish night, and Teresa knelt in her cell with hands pressed together so tightly her knuckles turned the color of bone. She had been praying for hours, her lips moving in silent devotion, her body rigid with the discipline she had cultivated over decades of monastic life. The other sisters slept soundly in their chambers, but Teresa had not known true rest in weeks. Something was shifting inside her, a presence that felt both familiar and utterly alien, a voice that whispered truths she could not ignore, and terrors she could not escape. She had always been a woman of intellect, a reader of theology, a questioner of doctrine, and yet here she was, reduced to trembling silence before something she could neither name nor deny. The candle beside her flickered as though disturbed by breath not her own. For years, Teresa had experienced what she described as locutions, divine communications that arrived not through her ears, but directly into the center of her being. These were not auditory hallucinations in the conventional sense. They were certainties, profound knowings that arrived with such clarity that questioning them felt like questioning the existence of her own heartbeat. She had written extensively about these experiences, attempting to categorize them, to create theological frameworks that would make them understandable to her confessors and to herself. There were intellectual visions, where concepts arrived fully formed in her mind. There were imaginative visions, where she saw scenes play out with vivid detail behind her closed eyes. And then there were the corporeal visions, the ones that involved her physical senses, the ones that left her body marked and transformed. But recently, the visions had begun to change in nature, becoming darker, more confusing, more psychologically invasive in ways that made her question every spiritual experience she had ever claimed. The ecclesiastical authorities had always been suspicious of her claims. Women who heard voices were dangerous to the church's hierarchy. They bypassed the need for priestly mediation, claimed direct access to divine wisdom, and could not be easily controlled or silenced. Teresa had learned to navigate this suspicion with remarkable political skill, always submitting her experiences to male confessors for validation, always framing her visions in language that reinforced rather than challenged church doctrine. She had survived multiple investigations, had convinced skeptical bishops of her authenticity, had even gained powerful allies who defended her mystical legitimacy. But this survival had come at a cost. She had internalized the church's paranoia, had learned to doubt herself as thoroughly as her interrogators doubted her, had developed an exhausting vigilance about the source of every spiritual experience. Was this vision from God or from the enemy of souls? This question had become the constant refrain of her interior life. The night the terrible vision arrived, Teresa had been contemplating the Passion with particular intensity. She had always found the suffering of the divine figure to be the most profound mystery of her faith. The idea that infinite power would choose infinite vulnerability, that omnipotence would embrace torture and humiliation. As she meditated on this paradox, her cell began to feel smaller, the air thicker, and suddenly she was no longer in the convent, but in some other space entirely. The transition was not gradual. There was no sense of falling asleep or entering a trance. One moment she was kneeling on cold stone, and the next she was somewhere else, somewhere that felt more real than reality itself. The space around her was neither light nor dark, but somehow both simultaneously, and in the center of this impossible place stood a figure that made her entire body freeze with terror. The figure was beautiful and terrible in equal measure, radiating a presence so overwhelming that Teresa felt her mind beginning to fracture under the weight of perceiving it. Was this the divine manifestation she had longed for her entire spiritual life? Or was this the deception she had been warned about since her first mystical experience? The figure did not speak with words, but communicated directly into her consciousness, bypassing language entirely, and what it told her shattered every certainty she had built over decades of devotion. It told her that she had been mistaken, that all her previous visions had been carefully constructed illusions, that she had never been in communication with the divine, but had instead been the plaything of forces that delighted in her confusion. The psychological impact of this revelation was immediate and catastrophic. If this vision was true, then her entire life had been a lie. If this vision was false, then she could no longer trust any spiritual experience, including the ones that had defined her identity. Teresa fell forward, her forehead striking the stone floor of her cell as the vision released her back into ordinary reality. Her breathing was ragged, her heart hammering against her ribs with such violence she thought it might tear through her flesh. Blood trickled from where her head had made impact, warm and sticky against her skin, but she barely registered the pain. The physical injury was nothing compared to the psychological wound that had just been inflicted. She had spent her entire adult life cultivating discernment, learning to distinguish between divine communication and demonic manipulation, developing theological criteria for evaluating mystical experiences. And in a single moment, all of that careful work had been rendered meaningless. If the devil could create a vision that felt more real than reality itself, more true than truth, more divine than divinity, then how could anyone, even someone as experienced and intellectually rigorous as herself, ever trust their own spiritual perceptions again? The days following the terrible vision were marked by a psychological deterioration that Teresa documented with terrifying precision in her private writings. She stopped eating, her body rejecting food as though nourishment itself had become spiritually suspect. She stopped sleeping, terrified that the moment she closed her eyes, the vision would return and complete whatever work of destruction it had begun. Her confessors noticed the change immediately. This woman, who had always been articulate and composed, was now barely coherent, speaking in fragmented sentences, returning obsessively to questions she had already resolved years ago. Was she being tested by the divine? Or was she being tormented by the demonic? The distinction that had once seemed so clear to her had collapsed into complete ambiguity, and with it, her sense of self was collapsing as well. The theological framework Teresa had inherited from her education taught that the devil was a master deceiver, capable of appearing as an angel of light, capable of producing false miracles, capable of speaking theological truths in order to eventually lead souls astray. This doctrine, meant to protect believers from spiritual error, had the paradoxical effect of making genuine spiritual experience almost impossible to verify with certainty. Any vision, no matter how beautiful or profound, could potentially be demonic in origin. Any sense of divine presence could be a carefully constructed trap. The only reliable safeguard, according to church teaching, was obedience to ecclesiastical authority. But what happened when your own interior experience contradicted the reassurances of your confessors? What happened when the terror you felt was so intense that no amount of theological reasoning could dispel it? Teresa found herself trapped in an epistemological nightmare where every attempt to find solid ground only revealed more layers of potential deception. The psychological warfare she endured during this period was not simply a matter of doubt. It was a systematic dismantling of the cognitive structures that had given her life meaning and coherence. Every memory of a previous vision was now contaminated with suspicion. Had that moment of spiritual ecstasy been genuine, or had it been the first stage of a long deception? Had that sense of divine love been real, or had it been the devil establishing credibility so that later, more destructive lies would be believed? The retroactive contamination of her entire spiritual history was perhaps the most psychologically devastating aspect of the experience. It was not simply that she doubted her present state, she doubted her past, her memories, her very identity as a mystic. If her mystical experiences had defined who she was, and those experiences were now suspect, then who was she? What was left when you removed the core narrative of your own life? Teresa's desperation led her to seek validation from multiple sources simultaneously. She consulted with her regular confessor, but also sought out other priests, other theologians, anyone who might be able to provide certainty about the nature of her experiences. The responses she received were maddeningly inconsistent. Some told her the vision was clearly demonic and should be rejected entirely. Others suggested it might be a divine test of her faith, a dark night of the soul meant to purify her attachment to consoling experiences. Still others proposed that it might be a mixture of divine and demonic elements, requiring careful discernment to separate the true from the false. The lack of consensus among religious authorities, who were supposed to possess expertise in these matters, only deepened her terror. If trained theologians could not agree on how to interpret her experience, how could she possibly hope to navigate this territory on her own? The physical toll of this psychological warfare manifested in symptoms that would today be recognized as severe anxiety and trauma response. Teresa experienced chest pains so intense she believed she was dying, heart palpitations that left her gasping for breath, episodes of dissociation where she felt completely disconnected from her own body. She described feeling as though her soul was being torn in multiple directions simultaneously, pulled between heaven and hell with such violence that she thought she might literally be ripped apart. Her sleep, when it came at all, was filled with nightmares that continued the psychological assault, dreams where she was surrounded by beings who claimed to be angels but revealed themselves to be demons, dreams where she was in the presence of the divine but discovered too late that she had been deceived. The boundary between waking and sleeping states became increasingly blurred, and she began to fear that she was losing her grip on consensus reality entirely. What made the psychological warfare particularly unbearable was that Teresa could not simply dismiss the vision as false and move on with her life. The vision had felt more real than any other spiritual experience she had ever had, more vivid, more immediate, more undeniably present. To reject it entirely would require her to reject the epistemological framework she had used to validate all her other mystical experiences. But to accept it as true would require her to conclude that she had been deceived for decades, that everything she had written about divine communication was based on lies, that her entire spiritual life was a monument to her own gullibility. She was trapped between two forms of annihilation. Either her past self had to die, or her present self had to be declared insane. There was no middle ground, no comfortable compromise, no way to integrate this experience into her existing worldview without fundamentally destroying that worldview in the process. The breaking point came on a cold morning when Teresa found herself unable to enter the chapel for communal prayer. Her body simply refused to move toward the sacred space, as though some invisible force was physically restraining her. The other sisters watched with concern as she stood frozen in the corridor, tears streaming down her face, her mouth moving in what might have been prayer or might have been incoherent muttering. This was not the composed, articulate mystic they had come to respect and fear. This was a woman on the edge of complete psychological collapse, someone who had been pushed beyond the limits of what a human mind could endure. The prioress approached her gently, placed a hand on her shoulder, and Teresa recoiled as though she had been burned, screaming that she could no longer tell who was touching her, whether it was a sister in the faith or a demon wearing human form. In her desperation, Teresa turned to practices that bordered on self-harm, believing that physical pain might somehow clarify her spiritual confusion or prove the authenticity of her devotion. She intensified her penances beyond what was required or recommended by her rule, wore instruments of mortification that left her flesh raw and bleeding, deprived herself of sleep and food to the point where her body began to shut down. These were not the controlled ascetic practices of a disciplined mystic. These were the frantic measures of someone trying to establish any kind of certainty in a world where all certainty had vanished. If she could feel physical pain, at least that was real. If she could punish her body, perhaps that would prove she was not already in hell. The logic was fundamentally broken, but it was the only logic available to someone whose rational faculties had been overwhelmed by terror. The ecclesiastical response to her deterioration was both predictable and profoundly inadequate. Her confessors ordered her to cease all mystical practices, to focus on ordinary prayer and manual labor, to essentially abandon the spiritual path that had defined her life. This directive, meant to be protective, felt to Teresa like a confirmation of her worst fears, that the authorities believed her visions had been demonic all along, that they were now trying to save her from herself, that she had been declared spiritually unsafe. At the same time, she was instructed to document everything she experienced, to write detailed accounts of her visions and her current psychological state, ostensibly so that trained theologians could evaluate her case more thoroughly. The contradiction was cruel. She was told to stop having mystical experiences, while simultaneously being ordered to analyze and record them in minute detail. During this period, Teresa wrote some of the most psychologically revealing passages in all of mystical literature. She described the sensation of being watched constantly by unseen presences, never knowing whether they were divine or demonic. She wrote about the agony of prayer becoming warfare, every attempt at devotion turning into a battlefield where she fought for possession of her own soul. She documented moments of such profound despair that she seriously contemplated whether her entire vocation had been a mistake, whether she should have been a mystic at all, whether her intellectual pride had led her to claim experiences she had no right to claim. These writings reveal not just a religious crisis, but a fundamental identity crisis. If she was not the mystic Teresa of Avila, then who was she? What remained when you removed the core narrative that had given your life purpose and meaning? The turning point in her psychological warfare came not through theological reasoning or ecclesiastical validation, but through a moment of such complete exhaustion that her defenses simply collapsed. She had been praying for hours, begging for clarity, demanding that either God or the devil reveal themselves definitively so she could at least know who she was fighting. And in that moment of total surrender, in the space where all her intellectual frameworks had finally broken down completely, she experienced something that felt like neither divine nor demonic, but simply silence. A profound, peaceful silence that asked nothing of her, demanded no interpretation, required no validation from confessors or theologians. In that silence, the question that had been tormenting her, was the terrible vision from God or the devil, suddenly seemed less important than she had thought. Perhaps the vision itself was not the point. Perhaps what mattered was how she responded to the uncertainty, whether she could continue to live and love and serve even when absolute certainty was impossible. But this moment of peace was fragile and temporary. The question of the vision's origin remained unresolved, and Teresa would spend the rest of her life managing the psychological aftermath of those weeks when she had stood at the edge of madness and looked into the abyss. She never fully recovered the certainty she had possessed before the terrible vision. She learned to live with ambiguity, to function in a state of provisional faith rather than absolute conviction, to accept that discernment was an ongoing process rather than a destination she could reach and then relax. The Church would eventually canonize her, declaring her visions authentically divine, but Teresa herself never achieved that level of certainty again. She had seen too deeply into the mechanism of spiritual deception to ever fully trust her own perceptions. And perhaps that is the most terrifying revelation of all, that even the saints doubt, even the holiest among us live with uncertainty. Even those who speak most confidently about the divine are haunted by the possibility that they have been deceived. The edge of madness is not a destination you reach and then return from unchanged. It is a place that, once visited, leaves permanent scars on the soul, reminders that the line between sanctity and insanity is thinner than we ever want to admit.